Chapter 712. North Slope. General Golang, who had also received Agar Dorji's message, was in high spirits. As a general who had rendered meritorious service, he wanted to obtain military merits more than anyone else. However, the North Slope was difficult to attack, so he was unable to fulfill his ambition. Now, Lord Golang said that the battle in the southern forest was going smoothly. After the battle, many mercenaries were eliminated. In order to defend there, it was very likely that they would transfer troops from other places to the southern forest. In this way, Golang's opportunity had appeared. The so-called 10,000 taels of silver for being the first to attack the beginning city did not excite Glenn. He was more interested in this first contribution. This was also a good opportunity for him to wash away his shame. Therefore, after he received the news, he had been sending people to watch every move of the mercenaries on the North Slope. However, the more anxious he was, the more there was no news. Half an afternoon and a night passed, but there were still no clues. Just when Golang was a little impatient and was thinking about whether to send people to ask Lord Golang again, the scout finally sent news that the mercenaries on the North Slope were moving. They seemed to be changing their guard. A large number of people were moving, but because of the terrain, they could not see clearly what was happening. They must have received orders to send reinforcements to the battlefield in the southern forest. After the scout finished reporting the news, Golang was excited and made some arbitrary conclusions. "General, if that's the case, why don't we attack now and attract the enemy here? This is equivalent to giving Lord Golang more opportunities." The scout misunderstood and asked. "There's no need for that." Golang immediately shook his head. This was an opportunity for him to perform meritorious service. How could he give it to others? Therefore, while shaking his head, he said aloud, "Lord Golang has already sent an order for us to find a way to rush to the beginning city. This is the greatest support for Lord Golang, understand?" "Understood, General." The scout replied as if he had understood the situation. After convincing the scout, Golang said with a slightly excited expression, "How about this, you find a way to get as close to the enemy as possible and watch their movements. Once you find that they have finished deploying their troops, inform me. Then, prepare the entire army and launch a fierce attack in 2 hours." Golang still had some brains. He did not attack immediately because he wanted to create an opportunity for the other party to divide their forces. Only in this way could he seize the opportunity to make contributions and rush to the beginning city. His goal was to directly rush into the city. By then, the mercenaries would no longer have a base behind them. With a pincer attack, it would be the time to destroy the mercenaries. If he could really do this, Golang would have defeated the war god of the great Ming dynasty. As a result, his name would resound throughout the entire grassland. At that time, who would dare to look down on him? At that time, he would be able to raise his voice even in front of Lord Agar Dorj. Glenn was very excited and looked forward to the future. However, he did not know that the mercenaries on the North Slope were not really splitting up. They were just faking it. They had even dug a large enough pit to trap horses on the top of the slope, and had even joined forces with the Tiger's main independent regiment that had rushed over from the West River. They were just waiting for him to attack, and then they would give him a head-on blow and take him down in one fell swoop. This was originally one of Yang Chendong's plans. First, he would engage in a battle with the main force of the Tatar army on the battlefield that was most suitable for cavalry charges. In order to show the enemy that he was weak, he deliberately lowered the power of the continuous fire guns. This was to make Agar Dorj underestimate the enemy and think that he would definitely mobilize troops from the other 2 places in order to defend the southern forest. Once this news spread to the West River and the North Slope, they would fall into the trap and send out troops. In this way, he could gather the superior forces to launch a counterattack and achieve his goal of defeating them one by one. In this way, he could gather the main force of the Tatar army again and achieve his goal of defeating them in one battle. Golang, who did not know about this, was eager to make contributions. When he heard that the mercenaries on the top of the slope might have split up, he looked for an opportunity to kill his way up. Only half an hour after he received the news, the mercenaries who rushed to support the southern forest should have gone far away and would not be back for a while. The Tatar cavalry under the slope had begun to attack. Although it was said to be a slope, it was not very urgent. It was just that the slope was longer and was not suitable for the cavalry to charge. However, if the cavalry worked hard, they would still be able to charge up. It was just that they would need more time. This time, it was no longer a probing attack. The first charge was to send out 2,000 cavalry as the vanguard. Different from the previous two charges, these 2,000 cavalry were only met with sporadic resistance and had already charged halfway up the slope. Looking at the top of the slope, there were only a few hundred mercenaries who were giving out bows and arrows. As expected. Seeing that the front army was progressing so smoothly, Golang laughed endlessly. He finally gave the order for the entire army to attack. Immediately, 10,000 Tatar cavalry loudly shouted and charged up the slope from the bottom of the mountain. On the top of the slope, the independent regiment's commander Tiger, Mane and the cavalry reinforced regiment's commander Windchaser used binoculars to stare at the Tatar cavalry under the slope. The two of them revealed a look of disbelief. What a good-for-nothing. Even if it is a charge, it should not be so fast. Windchaser shook his head and put down the binoculars in his hand. He sighed and said, good for a good-for-nothing. Our plan can be carried out even more smoothly. We can go support the southern forest even faster. The young master has been waiting for our good news. Tiger Mane also put down the binoculars in his hand. Then he reached for his waist and took out a 54 handgun. It was the basic equipment for mercenary officers and above. It was also a symbol of status. With Tiger Mane's status, he had already been equipped with this kind of high-level weapon. Now that he took it out, he was preparing to launch a counterattack. Windchaser also took out a 54 handgun from his waist. Then he carefully wiped it again and again. When the entire body of the gun was wiped until it seemed like it was reflecting light, he opened the safety and aimed it at the top of the slope. This time, he also wanted to have fun with a handgun. Seeing Windchaser's excited appearance, Tiger Mane smiled and kindly reminded him. Commander Windchaser, a handgun is not like a spear. The shooting distance is limited. If it is too far, it won't have any effect. I know. Windchaser repeatedly nodded. However, it could be seen that Windchaser was still a bit nervous. It was just like the first time he held a blade and rode on a horse. The two commanders only hid and didn't move. The other mercenaries also waited in their positions. Just like this, the Tatar cavalry charged halfway up the slope and into their line of sight. Deng Yu, who was in charge of luring the enemy, looked like he was going all out to stop the advance of the Tatar cavalry. However, it was obvious that because of the small number of people, he was powerless. Seeing the enemy rushing up, he immediately panicked and shouted to retreat. Immediately, hundreds of cavalry turned around and fled. That clean and neat appearance attracted bursts of laughter from the Tatar cavalry behind. Under the laughter, Golang also rushed to the top of the slope with the main cavalry. He also saw the scene of Deng Yu leading the cavalry to retreat. Good. Now we have successfully reached the top of the slope. Next, it is time for us to make a contribution. Boys, charge together with this general. The first to reach the beginning city will be rewarded with 100 silver taels. After Golang shouted to boost the morale, the Tatar cavalry in front of him shouted excitedly. Then they rushed forward crazily. They wanted to follow behind Deng Yu to see if they could kill the enemy in the process of chasing. At the same time, they also wanted to get closer to the beginning city. In this way, Deng Yu ran in front. Behind him, there were tens of thousands of Tatar cavalry waving their sabers. From time to time, there would be people shooting arrows. Although the distance was still far and it was impossible to shoot, it did have a big deterrent effect. Deng Yu, who was running in front, looked back from time to time. When he saw that the Tatar cavalry had indeed fallen into the trap and caught up with him, the corner of his eyes showed a trace of a proud smile. He looked back and saw the inconspicuous road sign on the side of the road. He said loudly to the cavalry warriors beside him, "We will soon reach the horse trap area." Everyone split up according to the plan. The mercenary cavalry who had been informed in advance of the trap immediately split into two sides, leaving the dangerous area and continuing to run forward. Some of the Tatar cavalry who were less than a mile behind also noticed this scene, but they didn't take it to heart. In their opinion, the enemy was probably in a panic and didn't know where to go. Since that was the case, they would just chase after them. Perhaps they were eager to make a contribution, perhaps they were impatient and careless, or perhaps they were arrogant and underestimated the enemy. In short, the Tatar cavalry broke into the horse trap that the mercenaries had already dug. Previously, they had considered the large number of enemies, so when the horse trap was dug, the scale was very large. It was more than 30 meters wide and 3 miles long. It consumed a lot of manpower and material resources, and now it could finally be put to use. Without any surprise, the Tatar cavalry fell into the trap. Before the first row of cavalry realized what was going on, their warhorses' heads sank and they fell into the 4-meter-deep pit. This was only the beginning. More and more Tatar cavalry fell into the pit like dumplings. They were advancing dauntlessly, wave after wave, and there was no break in between. One after another, more than half of the 2,000 vanguard cavalry fell into the pit. This finally attracted the attention of the other cavalry behind them. More and more Tatar cavalry pulled on the reins of their warhorses and stopped in place. "What's going on?" General Glenn rushed over under the protection of a group of soldiers. When he saw the scene in front of him, he could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. More than 1,000 cavalry fell into the pit, and most of them were injured because of the trampling of their warhorses. Some of them were even covered in blood and died. Chapter 7:13. Bastards, damn mercenaries. Seeing that he had lost more than 10% of his troops, Glenn was naturally furious. When he raised his head to look at the mercenaries who were still retreating along the path, he said angrily, "Chase, continue to chase after them. They don't have any more tricks up their sleeves. I want to catch them and tear them into pieces." In Glenn's view, this was clearly the last resort of the mercenaries. This also proved that the other party had no other tricks up their sleeves. Otherwise, how could they set up such a big trap? It was too late and they didn't have time to rescue the cavalry who fell into the pit. After asking them to think of a way to save themselves, Glenn led most of the cavalry and continued to pursue the enemy. For safety reasons, he deliberately sent a cavalry team of 100 people to walk in front to prevent the appearance of traps. Obviously, this kind of worry was unnecessary. Large-scale horse traps required a lot of manpower and resources. Even if the mercenaries had individual shovels in their hands, it would be much easier to dig them out. However, such a large-scale trap with a wide area was not something that could be easily dug out. After chasing for another 3 miles, they were still very safe. This also made the Tatar cavalry who was originally nervous began to feel relieved. They began to speed up. Glenn, who was walking in the team, thought that at this speed, they should be able to reach the beginning city around noon. Disaster always came when there was the most hope, just like the darkness before dawn. Just when the Tatar cavalry thought that they saw hope and discovered that the distance between them and the mercenaries was shortened from 1 mile to less than 300 meters, suddenly, a loud gunshot broke the previous silence. Tiger's Mane, who was hiding in the grass on both sides of the road, opened fire. With the help of the half-meter-tall grass, he fired the first shot and hit a centurion who was shouting to urge the cavalry to move forward. The gunshot was an order. This shot led Windchaser to fire a shot as well. It was a pity that he still needed to practice his marksmanship. Although the distance was less than 40 meters, this shot still missed and didn't hurt anyone. But it didn't matter. After this shot, it attracted the attention of the 4 independent battalions who were lying in ambush at the same time. They were the only firearm battalion other than the 2 southern forest battalions. The 4 battalions had a total of 1,600 men. Gunshots rang out in unison, and in just one wave, they killed the 1,000 Tatar cavalry charging at the front. When the Tatar cavalrymen were killed one after another, the entire Tatar cavalrymen were shocked and panicked. At this moment, along with the second wave of gunfire, the mercenaries who were fleeing stopped in their tracks. Not only that, but thousands of cavalrymen also appeared beside them. They brandished their sabers or held bows and arrows as they charged towards them. The arrogant Tatar cavalry was stunned by the sudden change in front of them. They watched as their companions were killed one by one on their horses. When they saw the cavalry getting closer and closer, many arrows were already falling in front of them. Some of their companions were even injured. They began to feel fear. The vanguard cavalry was killed by spears or arrows one by one. They were unable to exert enough fighting power. It was like a fist being held down by someone. When they were unable to kill the enemy, the strength of the Tatar cavalry was suppressed to the greatest extent. They could only passively take a beating. Don't panic, the warriors in front will attack the enemy with your sabers, the warriors in the back will be ready to attack. Seeing that the situation wasn't good, Gulang yelled. He knew that he had fallen into the enemy's trap, but at this moment, he didn't have a better solution. If he retreated now, he might not have the chance to make a comeback. So, he could only endure. The shout of the commander calmed down some of the Tatar cavalrymen. Some of them brandished their sabers and charged forward, while others held their bows and arrows ready to counterattack. After all, they had lived on horseback since they were young. Although there was an unknown change in the situation, their good psychological quality allowed them to quickly calm down. Throw grenades and break the enemy's formation. Prepare the bazookas and break their psychological defense. Tiger's Mane, who was hiding on the side of the road, was also shocked by the Tatar cavalryman's fighting spirit. Fortunately, he still had a backup plan that could break the enemy's psychological defense. Under the order, some of the soldiers of the independent regiment took out the weapons they had prepared for a long time from their backs or waists. Tiger's Mane specifically asked them to stay behind when the 3 divisions of the Cold Front Division left. There were still a lot of grenades, and although there weren't many bazookas, it was still enough to deter the enemy. When these heavy weapons were taken out and activated, countless grenades were thrown at the Tatar cavalrymen like rain. There were also 2 bazookas loaded with shells and began to fire. The situation on the battlefield instantly became very tense. Boom 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 boom, boom boom boom. Boom. First, there was a series of loud bangs from the grenades. They smashed a huge hole in the Tatar cavalry, causing countless warhorses to lose their composure amidst their neighs. They no longer listened to the orders of the cavalrymen and danced wildly. 2 rocket launchers were launched to completely suppress the Tatar cavalry's charge. When one of the rocket launchers landed 200 meters away in the enemy's main camp, the fighting spirit that had just been gathered due to Gulang's words suffered a heavy blow in an instant. Under the roar of the bazooka, the cavalrymen were completely stunned by the scene of flames and debris flying in the air. They had never seen such a situation before and didn't know how to deal with it. The warhorses under them became the fuse that led to their final defeat. The warhorses were terrified and ran for their lives. They didn't care about the feelings of their masters and didn't listen to any of their orders. It was a mess, a complete mess. In the chaos, horses bumped into each other and people bumped into each other. Before the mercenary cavalrymen rushed to the front, the Tatar cavalrymen had already fallen into the process of killing each other. One after another, the cavalrymen were thrown off their horses. One after another, the warhorses crashed into each other and fell to the ground. This time, Go Lang wasn't spared. After all, when the warhorse went crazy, he didn't care if it was an ordinary soldier or a general who commanded thousands of troops. Under extreme fear, they only knew how to instinctively run and crash in all directions. Before Go Lang could continue to issue orders, he was thrown to the ground by the warhorse. Then, he was unlucky enough to be trampled by another warhorse that came out of nowhere. A weight of more than 1,000 kilograms pressed down on his body, causing Glenn to involuntarily open his mouth and widen his eyes. A series of crisp sounds rang in his ears. It was the sound of his ribs being crushed. Pfff. A mouthful of blood spurted out from Go Lang's mouth without warning. When the warhorse finally trampled over him, he was unfortunately trampled by another warhorse from afar. Under the continuous trampling, the only thing Go Lang could do was to keep coughing up blood. Then, the strength in his body started to disappear. At the same time, the blood in his body and the strength in his breath also disappeared. In such a chaotic world, Go Lang reluctantly closed his eyes and breathed his last breath. Go Lang was dead. With the death of their general, the soldiers under him lost their commander and the formation became even more chaotic. In addition, there were more than 1 or 2 Tatar cavalrymen who suffered the same fate as Glenn. When the number of Tatar cavalrymen gradually grew to a certain scale, their will to resist was completely worn away. The remaining Tatar cavalrymen only wanted to escape from this purgatory of the human world. They had no other thoughts. Charge. Kill. Dismount and throw your swords. Those who surrender will not be killed. At this moment, a large number of mercenary cavalry arrived. Taking advantage of this unstoppable momentum and chaos, they slaughtered their way into the chaotic Tatar cavalry as if they were in a no-man's land. Raising their swords, they chopped down one enemy after another under their horses. Under the strong morale, many of the defeated Tatar cavalrymen chose to surrender. After all, knowing that they would die if they resisted, it was not bravery but foolishness. 10,000 Tatar cavalrymen suffered heavy losses, especially under the attacks of muskets, grenades, and rocket launchers. Their will to fight was disintegrated. In the end, they abandoned their remaining will to fight and their dignity. They became defeated soldiers and captives. Who? Tiger Edge let out a long sigh and stood up from the grass. He then looked at Wind Chaser, who had an equally excited expression, and said, "Let's hurry up. The young master is still waiting for us to reinforce and regroup." Okay. Wind Chaser also knew that they were able to obtain victory here because of the support of the independent firearms unit. Since they had won, what they needed to do now was to rush to the southern forest with the fastest speed and meet up with the 6th young master to annihilate the last of the Tatar cavalrymen. Come, hurry up and clean up the battlefield. If anyone doesn't surrender, kill them. Don't waste time. The will to fight had been defeated, so the next step was much easier. Clean up the battlefield and capture the captives. Wind Chaser had already given the order. The soldiers under him still wanted to go to the southern forest and continue to make contributions. In their impatience, whenever they encountered a Tatar cavalryman who showed resistance or didn't surrender, they would kill them without saying anything. It was precisely because of such cruel actions that the Tatar cavalry became afraid. These mercenaries really didn't take human lives seriously. When they saw someone coming over to persuade them to surrender, they didn't dare to hesitate and threw down their swords and dismounted from their horses. 10,000 cavalrymen, 3,000 died, 2,000 were injured, and 5,000 were captured. And to complete these actions, it only took them 2 hours. It could be said that they were very fast. Send 1,000 cavalrymen and a battalion of firearms soldiers to transport the captives and the wounded back to the beginning city. The rest of you, follow me to the southern forest. Hurry. Seeing that the situation was settled, Tiger's Mane's voice was slightly anxious. He was really worried about the young master's safety. Chapter 7:14. southern forest. Since the morning, Agador had issued a decision to send out a small group of cavalry to provoke the enemy. According to Agador, what they had to do now was to constantly put pressure on the mercenaries on the opposite side, forcing them to withdraw their troops from the West River and the North Slope battlefield, creating an opportunity for the Tatar cavalry to advance. In this regard, General Su He expressed a different opinion. In his opinion, since they already knew the strength of the enemy's army, what they should do now was to immediately launch a decisive battle and rely on their advantage in numbers to severely injure the enemy, instead of launching a probing attack to give the enemy more time to prepare. General Su, you have seen the strength of the mercenaries, especially their firearms, which can be said to be accurate and long-range. Do you think that if we fight head-on, there will be a winner in the end? Injuring the enemy and losing 800 of our own men is not what I want. I have never thought of swallowing the mercenaries. To be honest, we don't have that big of an appetite. Our goal is to drive them away and occupy the beginning city. So, don't ask for a battle. Let's focus on the overall situation. After seeing Su He ask for a battle several times in a row, Agador finally lost his patience and said this somewhat angrily. Seeing that Agador had made up his mind, Su He could do nothing but feel heartache. Walking out of the military camp, he looked up at the sky helplessly, and then said sadly, God wants me to die. Compared with Agar Dorji's so-called view of the overall situation, in Su He's view, it was just a manifestation of timidity. It was because this person was afraid of death, afraid that the army would be severely damaged, and afraid that his own strength would be damaged, so he placed his hopes on the other two routes. But in fact, whether it was Haraluaku or Glen, Su He did not think highly of them. Of these two, one was born as a son of a rich family, and the other was a general of a defeated army. Both of them belonged to the kind of people who had no strategy. It was simply self-deceiving and extremely unrealistic and irresponsible to put the hope of victory on them. It was just that Agador believed too much in the saying that numbers could defeat everything. He didn't listen to her advice at all, which made Su He feel helpless. The only thing he could do was to watch small troops step forward and serve as whetstones for the mercenaries. That's right, when the mercenaries faced the Tatar cavalry, they did not choose to charge with their entire army. Instead, they chose to send small groups to harass the Tatar cavalry. After dispatching the main force of the independent regiment, Yang Chendong was left with less than 5,000 cavalry. Facing more than 10,000 Tatar cavalry, unless he was willing to take out all the firearms in his warehouse, it would be extremely difficult for him to win. Even Yang Chendong was prepared for the worst. If he couldn't hold on, he would slowly retreat and use the cooperation of the two-gun battalions to exchange space for time. As long as the enemies at the West River and the North Slope were dealt with, he would have more troops to deploy. At that time, it would be time for him to launch an all-out counterattack. Unexpectedly, the other party seemed to know what he was thinking and cooperated with him. They did not choose to charge with their entire army, but instead sent small groups to harass the enemy. This was exactly what he wanted. After discussing with the two regimental commanders, Yella and Luzhua, he decided to send a small group of cavalry to confront the enemy head-on and treat it as actual combat training. It was true that Agador brought elite Tatar cavalry, but the strength of the mercenaries was not bad either. In particular, their training was several times better than the other forces. It could be said that the combat strength of the cavalry was increasing every day. In addition, their cavalry sabers were sharp and tough, which increased their chances of winning by a bit. Now that the other party wanted to fight with fewer people, of course they would help. In this way, the other side would send out a few hundred people, and the other side would send out a few hundred people. Both sides began a cavalry charge outside the vast southern forest. A cavalry charge focused on morale and proficiency in horsemanship. One had to know how to use the warhorse as a part of one's body and control it flexibly. Of course, the sharpness of the weapon also played a large role. In terms of morale, there was nothing to say about the mercenaries. Yang Chendong, who did not lack money, gave them high rewards in terms of money. Not only that, but being a soldier under him also gave them a good social status. Not only would a soldier bring glory to his family, but he could also feed his family. Their horsemanship had also improved under hard training. Even if they could not compare to the elites of the Mongol cavalry, normal cavalry would not be a match for them. Furthermore, the cavalry swords were made by the Chimeric City Munitions Factory, so the materials used were abundant. Its sharpness and toughness were unparalleled, which made up for some of the shortcomings in horsemanship. They had high morale, excellent horsemanship, and excellent weapons. In a true battle of 100 cavalry against 100 cavalry, the mercenary cavalry would not be afraid of anyone. This was especially so when they had the 3-to-3 tactic. Although it was not as effective as on land, it was enough to increase their combat strength. All, in a cavalry charge with equal numbers, the mercenaries were not afraid of anyone. Even if the opponent was the Tatar cavalry, and the elites of the Tatar cavalry, the outcome would be the same. This was evident from the 3 consecutive battles. In the first battle, they killed 60 enemy cavalry and lost 40 of their own. In the second battle, they killed 70 enemy cavalry and lost 43 of their own. In the third battle, they killed 55 enemy cavalry and lost 45 of their own. The first and second battles were fought by the Nuzhan cavalry. In the third battle, it was Lu Zhua's 2nd Cavalry Regiment. Just from the results of the battle, the Nuzhan cavalry was indeed very powerful, worthy of their name. Of course, this result had a lot to do with the cavalry swords in their hands. In the end, the results were mostly because the enemy's cavalry swords were broken and could not fight anymore. After 3 consecutive battles, the mercenaries' morale was even higher. On the other hand, the Tatar cavalry were not in a good situation. General Su He's face was even gloomier. She thought that the previous defeat was because the other side used guns and had good tactical cooperation. She was defeated by the combination of inside and outside. But now, it seemed that there was no need for tactics. With the same number of soldiers, they were no match for the enemy. This made him have another thought. Was it a mistake to choose to be the enemy of the mercenaries this time? The Tatar cavalry needed to find a new base because of the lack of provisions, but did it have to be the beginning city? But it was obviously too late to say this now. The war had already begun, and it was no longer a situation where one side could retreat as they wished. For example, if they ordered a retreat now, it would be a great blow to the Tatar cavalry's morale. If the mercenaries chased after them at this time, it was likely to lead to a one-sided battle. If that was the case, they would lose without a fight. Feeling that if the battle continued like this, even if there was good news from the West River and the North Slope, the morale of the troops would still be damaged. Su He once again walked into the tent of Commander-in-Chief Agar Dorj and put forward his request. That was, they could not continue fighting. Sir, we can't continue fighting. After 3 battles, we have lost. The morale of the troops has begun to become unstable. Su He said with a worried face. Yes, Agar Dorj, who was sitting at the head of the tent, replied absent-mindedly. Sir, you. What are you thinking about? Seeing that Agar Dorj's expression was a little ugly, Su He asked casually out of concern. It's nothing. It's just that the scouts we sent out suddenly stopped responding. There's also no news from the West River and the North Slope. It's been almost a day. Do you think there's a problem? Agar Dorj hesitated for a moment, but considering that Su He was his general, there were some things that he should not hide from him. So, he carefully told him what had happened. What? Originally, Su He thought that Agar Dorj was too tired from the battle and had some problems with his body. However, when he heard this question, his jaw dropped in shock. The scouts' communication with the outside world had been cut off. What did this mean? It meant that they had become deaf and blind, which was a taboo in war. When 2 armies fought, although it did not necessarily require one to know the situation of the other side, one should at least know where one's own troops were. But now, they were not even clear about their own situation. What could it be other than a big problem? How long ago did this happen? He felt a strong sense of crisis, and he was even more anxious to know the specific details of the matter. After the battle yesterday afternoon, there was no news from the outside world. At first, I thought that the scouts might have gone to rest because it was dark, but there was still no news until dawn. In the morning, I sent out some more scouts and told them that no matter what happened, they had to report back within 4 hours. But now, it has been 6 hours, and not a single scout has returned. As Agadorji spoke, he looked at Suhi. It seemed that he was asking for her advice and wanted to hear her opinion. It could be seen that Agar Dorj still had a trace of hope in his eyes. Perhaps he was still thinking that the scouts had been delayed by something and that they would return to report to him after a while. Suhi's mind was much calmer than Agar Dorj's. What was a scout? They were the most flexible people in an army. They were all warriors that were picked out of 100. Not only were their individual qualities strong, but their reactions were also very agile. Under normal circumstances, it was rare for a mission to go wrong when it was assigned to them. But now, there was no news from all the scouts that were sent out. There could only be one possibility, and that was that there was a collective problem. In other words, there should have been an inescapable net set up around them long ago, completely enveloping them. Chapter 7:15. That was the only way for such an outcome to occur. In the face of such an obvious problem, Agadorji, as the commander-in-chief, still had a fluke and fantasy mentality. Suhi was so angry that she couldn't say a word. However, this wasn't the time to pursue the matter. Instead, he had to solve the problem. Although there was anger in her heart, Suhi still suppressed the anger in her heart. She tried to say in a calm but anxious tone, "Your Excellency, I'm afraid things are not good now." "How is it not looking good?" Hearing Suhi's analysis, Agar Dorji's heart skipped a beat. "My lord, scouts are the strongest army. Even if they don't complete the mission well, they should still be able to return and report back. But now that they can't even do that, it can only mean that something has happened to them. Not only them, but I'm afraid that young Master Hala and General Gulang aren't in a good situation either." Suhi voiced out his suspicions. "They aren't in a good situation either? That can't be. They have a total of 15,000 cavalrymen, and how many mercenaries do they have? Their main force can't even move in front of us, so how could they have the strength to attack us?" Agar Dorji said with a look of disbelief. "My lord, now is not the time to be thinking about luck. We didn't know how strong the mercenaries are before, but after these 2 days, it's obvious that we underestimated them. Since that's the case, anything is possible. For safety's sake, I suggest that we retreat immediately and meet up with young Master Hala and General Gulang's troops." Suhi didn't dare to take any chances. A commander was walking on a single plank bridge. Being careful was one of the necessary qualities. Retreat now? Is it that serious? Agadorji finally looked at the situation seriously, his expression becoming more and more serious. "Yes," Suhi said in a very positive tone. Previously, they were worried that a sudden retreat would cause unnecessary trouble or even some unnecessary losses. But now, it seemed that there was no other choice but to retreat. It was better than being annihilated one by one. In the face of Suhi's resolute attitude, Agadorji's face finally crumbled. If the situation is as serious as the general says, then we should retreat. However, the arrangements will depend on the general's plan. All right, I'll arrange it now. It's already evening now. I'll immediately arrange for the army to start a fire and prepare a meal. When the sky is completely dark, we'll retreat overnight." Suhi cupped his fists with a solemn expression. "We'll do as you say." Agar Dorji's mind was already in a mess because of these words. He could no longer make any correct judgments and could only listen to his subordinate. He finally left the barracks. As soon as he came out, he took a deep breath and looked at the mercenary camp 5 miles away. He then narrowed his eyes and called a guard and said, "Order the army to start a fire and prepare a meal immediately. Also, arrange for 100 cavalry to challenge the mercenaries." The guard had a puzzled look on his face. Previously, the general was against such a small army fighting. It was no different from sending them to their deaths, and it would be a blow to their morale. Why did the general change his mind in such a short period of time? But since it was the general's order, of course he would obey. After cupping his fists, he turned around and made the arrangements. After watching the guard leave, he looked at the mercenary camp again and murmured, "I underestimated you, but once we leave this time, the next time we come, we will definitely let you know the power of the Tatar cavalry." Mercenary camp. Yang Chendong was resting in the big tent when Beta Persei suddenly entered the tent to report that the Tatars had sent another 100 cavalry to challenge them. They sent people again? Yang Chendong raised his head when he heard this, a trace of doubt flashed in his eyes. Yes, they sent another 100-men team. They are now 2 miles away from our camp and have already set up a formation. Beta Persei nodded and replied. Then arrange for the 2nd Regiment to send a company of brothers to meet them. Oh, by the way, call Commander Yella and Luzhua to come over for a meeting. After Yang Chendong finished arranging, he instructed again. For some reason, he felt a faint sense of uneasiness in his heart. Beta Persei left, but after a cup of tea, he reappeared. Along with him were the commander of the Nuzan Cavalry Regiment, Yella, and the commander of the 2nd Regiment, Luzhua. "Hello, 6th young master." As soon as the 2 regimental commanders entered the tent, they were extremely respectful. "You're welcome, take a seat wherever you like." Beta Persei, serve the tea. Yang Chendong invited the 2 regimental commanders to sit in front of him with a smile on his face. As soon as the 2 of them sat down, he said, "It's almost dark, and the Tatars have sent troops to challenge us again. What do the 2 of you think?" Originally, the 2 of them were receiving tea from Beta Persei, but when they suddenly heard this, they were both stunned. Then the 2 regimental commanders looked at each other and fell into deep thought. Since it was the 6th young master who asked the question, it naturally wouldn't be so simple. Previously, the 2 of them didn't take this matter seriously. They thought that since the other party had challenged them 3 times in a day, it wouldn't be a big deal if there was a 4th time. But now, they didn't dare to think this way. Those who could become regimental commanders were those who were favored by Yang Chendong in the field of military affairs. They all had some skills, and some of them were even quite capable. Now that they were reminded, the 2 of them thought for a while and found the problem. Could it be that they're hiding something? Luzhua was the first to speak. Yella followed up and asked, "Could it be that they're going to make a big move and are using this as a cover?" Not only did Yang Chendong ask this question, but the 2 of them also said this. After thinking about it, they also found something strange. For example, why would they send cavalry to challenge them at such a late hour? For example, they had lost all 3 battles during the day, but why would they want to carry out a 4th battle? Could it be that they had found a way to attack? Just as the 2 regimental commanders finished speaking, the curtain of the military tent was lifted and the captain of the 1st Guard team, Chiu V, walked in. As soon as he came to Yang Chendong's side, he stood at attention and said, "Reporting to the 6th young master, the 100 Tatar cavalry that came to challenge us this time are the same as before. Also, you asked me to observe the other party's movements. The scout said that the other party is cooking, and the camp looks very busy." "That's right." After Yang Chendong heard this, he slapped his thigh and laughed. He felt that something was wrong before, so after Beta Persei went out, he called Chiu V and asked him to inquire about these 2 things. The answer to the first thing already proved that the other party didn't have any new methods or methods. In other words, the so-called Tatar cavalry didn't have any new methods to attack. The second thing was to see if there were any changes in the Tatar camp. The conclusion now confirmed a lot of things. It was the end of July, and the days were long and the nights were short. In order to prevent the soldiers from starving at night, meals were served late. Generally, when there was no war, meals wouldn't be served so early. Based on this alone, the Tatar camp's actions could be considered abnormal. What kind of person was Yang Chendong? With an extra lifetime of experience, the things he had seen and heard were far more powerful than the others. Especially his work in his previous life required him to be cautious. Many times, if the slightest problem was not discovered and solved in time, it would lead to irreparable consequences. So in terms of courage and carefulness, no one could compare to him. The sudden challenge from the Tatar cavalry made him vigilant, so it was not surprising. Of course, if Su He knew that he deliberately sent troops to challenge them in order to show that he was normal, but this kind of behavior was a bit excessive and would attract attention, he wouldn't know whether he should cry or cry. The enemy will definitely make a move. If my guess is correct, they are most likely preparing to retreat. Yang Chendong summarized the two pieces of information he just received. It was a bit arbitrary, but also a bit resolute. The enemy is retreating. Hearing the news, Yi La and Lu Zhuo were startled, but they quickly nodded. As the saying goes, when things are abnormal, there must be a demon. According to this kind of inference, the sixth young master's words were very reasonable. Since they guessed that the enemy was retreating, the two commanders immediately became spirited. Sixth young master, we should also immediately make preparations. Let's eat now and then keep an eye on them. Once we discover that they are retreating, we will chase after them and kill them. We will heavily injure or even wipe them out. No. To their surprise, Yang Chendong shook his head. Then he smiled and said, we will chase after them, but there is no need to eat. We can inform the soldiers to eat some cold food. In any case, the weather is hot right now, so it doesn't matter. The enemy doesn't want us to guess their intentions, so how can we not cooperate? Ha ha ha. By the way, Tiger's Mane and Windchaser should be rushing over with the army. Let's see where they are now. Yang Chendong's intention was to have a good rest at night and wait until tomorrow morning to launch an all-out counterattack. However, the plan was not as fast as changes. Since the enemy was already vigilant, the timing of the attack would naturally change. Young master, I will go and check. Beta Persei quickly nodded and walked out of the military tent. Yang Chendong was left behind to discuss the pursuit with the two commanders. After a while, Beta Persei walked back. Young master, I asked the scouts. They said that Tiger's Mane and Windchaser's Mane are rushing over to me. They should be able to meet us here in 1.5 hours. 1.5 hours. At that time, the sky will be dark. I'm afraid they won't give us that much time. Yang Chendong said thoughtfully. Then he seemed to have thought of something. He suddenly got up and came to the sand table. He looked at it very seriously, then pointed to the west of Nanlin and said, send scouts to inform Tiger's Mane and Windchaser. Tell them not to come to us directly. Go to the place where the Tatar army retreated and set up an ambush. Tell them that time is limited and they must rush over as fast as possible. We will try to buy them some more time. Beta Persei accepted the order and left. Yang Chendong looked at Yi La and Lu Zhuo and said, you two will have to work hard. Immediately go down and have a mobilization meeting. Remember, don't gather together. Tell the officers below to hold the meeting in a row. In short, don't attract the enemy's attention. Chapter 7:16. Tatar Camp. The cavalry was eating. Su He, who had finished his meal first, walked out of the military tent. A scout came to him and reported in a low voice, "General, there is nothing unusual on the side of the mercenaries." "Okay." He replied calmly, and his heart was slightly relieved. This time, they sacrificed another 100-man team to challenge the mercenaries. Presumably, the other party should still be immersed in the joy of victory. They probably wouldn't have thought that they, who had just challenged the mercenaries, were now ready to retreat. Speaking of which, he still had another way to go. That was to go all out and fight the mercenaries to the death. It was just that in this way, even if they could win, with the combat power of the mercenaries, they could only win with great difficulty. Without enough strength, even if they occupied the origin city, could they defend it? This was also a problem. In a big battle, they paid a sufficient price, but did not get the corresponding benefits. This was definitely not what he wanted, let alone what Agador wanted. In desperation, they had no choice but to retreat. Fortunately, no one would think that they would suddenly retreat when they had the advantage. In this way, once they gathered young Master Hararuo's troops and General Golang's troops, their strength was still not small. They could still attack and retreat freely. Didn't the Han people have a saying, "Where there is life, there is hope"? As long as they had enough strength, they would not die out in the grassland. At worst, they could go and snatch other people's territories. With the strength of nearly 40,000 cavalry in their hands, how many people could be their opponent? It was a pity that the origin city was not fated to be with them. Thinking of this, he still felt a little regretful. In this way, pass down the order. After eating, have a good rest. When the sky is completely dark, we will retreat. Inform all the cavalry that no one can light the torches. Just leave quietly. Since they had decided to leave, there was obviously no need to think about other things. After he shook his head vigorously, he instructed the scout beside him. It had to be said that he was worthy of being a famous general. He was very careful when doing things. If the opponent this time was not Yang Chendong but someone else, perhaps he would have been deceived by him. The sky gradually darkened, to the point where they had to use torches to see the road under their feet. But from afar, he could still see some shadows, so he wanted to wait a little longer. But at this moment, an unexpected thing happened. Suddenly, a scout came to report that the mercenaries had sent a team of 100 cavalrymen to challenge them. "They want to challenge me? It's already so late. Can you still see clearly?" He was surprised and puzzled when he heard the news. The scout also had a confused look on his face. He was only responsible for passing on the message. Other things were not for him to consider or question. "All right, since they're here, then let's fight. How about this, arrange a team of 100 to fight with them. But make sure to tell them that if they can't win, then retreat. There's nothing to be ashamed of. This is also my order." He did not want to agree, but if he did not agree, what would he do if the other side was alerted? In the end, he had no choice but to accept the challenge. What he didn't know was that this was just Yang Chendong's stalling tactic. He was giving He a taste of his own medicine. Right now, he needed time to give Tiger Edge, Windchaser, and the others some time. After thinking about it, sending someone to challenge them now was the best option. If it was a normal day, the Tatar tribe might not agree if they sent people to challenge them at this time. But now, they wanted to escape. As the saying goes, a thief has a guilty conscience. They would definitely accept the challenge. With this in mind, a company of cavalrymen was sent out. He did not think too much about it. In his opinion, the other side clearly wanted to continue showing off their strength. Moreover, he had issued 4 challenges during the day. Wouldn't he allow them to challenge him again? This was a very normal thing. Just like this, when night fell, both sides sent a team of 100 to fight on the prairie. The result was needless to say. Of course, the Tatar cavalrymen were defeated. Compared to the day, this battle was shorter. But even so, the mercenaries were able to gain half an hour of time. This was because even after the battle ended, the victorious mercenaries didn't retreat immediately. Instead, they stood on the spot and cursed for a while. After cursing to their heart's content, they laughed heartily and said that they were going back for dinner and returned happily. The scout came back with news that there were fireworks in the mercenary camp. This made Su He feel relieved. Since the other side chose to cook at this time, they must not have thought that he would escape. The opportunity finally came. Pass down the order. The army will retreat in order. Leave the torches and tents behind. In order to completely cover up the traces of the retreat, Su He made a lot of sacrifices. When the sky was completely dark, the Tatar cavalrymen finally began to retreat. Agar Dorj was in the army, and he retreated with the First Army. He left the dangerous task of covering the retreat to General Su He. Under the cover of the night, the scouts who were lurking within a mile of the Tatar camp saw everything with the help of night vision devices. Seeing that everything was as the sixth young master said, and that the enemy was really retreating overnight, the scouts secretly admired him and immediately sent someone to report the news. The mercenaries who did not hold torches had already mounted their horses, their swords were sheathed, and their bows were on their bodies. The news from the scouts confirmed the sixth young master's guess. There would be a big battle soon, and it would be a chase. All the soldiers were somewhat excited. Yang Chendong was also riding on the white dragon horse. After hearing the exact news from the scout, his expression was also filled with excitement, and he shouted a good word. The enemy had decided to retreat, and now was the time to beat a drowning dog. Yang Chendong pulled out the saber at his waist and loudly said to the 5,000 cavalrymen beside him, "Soldiers, it's time to perform a meritorious service. Pass down my order, pursue and beat the Tatar cavalrymen. Beat the Tatar cavalrymen." The roar was like a tsunami, followed by the movement of thousands of horses. The torches were lit again and held in their hands. Other than a small number of soldiers who stayed behind to guard the camp, the rest of the cavalry let out a loud roar and all of them patted their horses and madly galloped toward the Tatar camp. The Tatar cavalrymen who were retreating step by step according to the plan suddenly saw countless torches coming from the front. The torches were getting closer and closer, and they panicked for a moment. General Su He, who was commanding the army, was also shocked by the scene in front of him. His first thought was that his plan had been exposed, and the enemy knew about it. Things are not good. You, and you, follow me. The rest of you, quickly retreat. I will catch up with you later. As expected of Agar Dorji's number 1 general, Su He quickly calmed down and quickly gathered the 3,000 cavalrymen to stay behind to cover the retreat. The situation was too sudden, and it was useless to say anything. At this time, they needed time to retreat. Su He stepped forward bravely, holding the bow and arrow he often used, and shouted to the 3,000 cavalrymen behind him, "Follow me and use the bow and arrow to counterattack, and suppress the enemy's momentum." 3,000 cavalrymen and 3,000 arrows, under the simultaneous attack, the battle formation was very shocking. At least in Su He's opinion, it would not be a problem to hold on for a while. The rest of the Tatar army quickly retreated. Su He led the 3,000 cavalrymen and waited for the mercenaries to come closer. When the first torches were less than 200 meters away, Su He took the initiative to draw his bow and shouted, "Everyone, follow me and counterattack with the bow and arrow. Fire!" Suddenly, arrows were shot out like rain, heading straight for the mercenaries coming from afar. Wherever they shot, there were torches. This seemed to have become a target marker, allowing everyone to find the direction of their attacks in the dark. Ding ding dang dang. The arrows fell like a dense rain, and from time to time, the torches would suddenly stop and fall to the ground. Under such a dense counterattack of arrows, many of the mercenaries were shot down from their horses. However, there were still more cavalrymen who rushed over. The ones in the lead were the black-armored cavalrymen, who were led by Yang Chendong and more than 100 guards. Taking the lead on the battlefield not only gave a strong motivation to the soldiers below, but also improved their morale. On the battlefield, the actions of a general could indeed lead the army to have a more positive effect. Relying on the protection of his heavy armor, he ignored the enemy's arrows and allowed them to land on his body, creating clanking sounds. Soon, he closed the distance of 200 meters. Then, he brandished his saber and killed the Tatar cavalrymen on their horses. Turn around, retreat while fighting. Su He, who already knew the strength of the mercenary cavalry, knew that if he directly went up to fight with them, it would be difficult for the 3,000 cavalrymen, including himself, to escape alive. The only thing he could do now was to retreat while fighting. Only then could he see more chances of survival. Su He kept retreating, and the 3,000 Tatar cavalrymen also fought and retreated with him. However, the drawbacks of doing this were also very big. If they didn't form a sufficient defensive line, they wouldn't be able to resist the attack of the mercenaries. In such a retreat, the losses of the Tatar cavalrymen were naturally great. After a few exchanges, about 500 cavalrymen's corpses were left behind. Retreat quickly, use the arrows to counterattack while retreating. Knowing that if this continued, the 3,000 cavalrymen would be eaten sooner or later, Su He anxiously shouted. The Tatar cavalrymen were very obedient, or it could be said that they were very disciplined on the battlefield. After hearing Su He's words, they turned around and fled. While fleeing, they used the arrows from time to counterattack. In this way, the original cavalry charge evolved into a chase. At this moment, the archers on both sides displayed their ability to fight on horseback. Arrows flew back and forth, and it was very lively. Chapter 7:17. However, even if it was a clash of bows and arrows, there was still the matter of who was the main attacker and who was the auxiliary attacker. As the chase continued, it was clear that the mercenaries who were charging in from the front had an advantage. The Tatar cavalry who were constantly retreating had suffered losses, and the number of cavalry had been sharply decreasing. Fortunately, the sky was completely dark at this time. If it was daytime, the losses would be even greater. However, the night also had its disadvantages. As they continuously retreated, the formation of the Tatar cavalry was already extremely chaotic. Some of the cavalry had run off to who knows where, making it impossible for them to form an effective defensive formation. They were unable to form a dense net like the mercenaries once they launched an arrow attack. As they kept retreating and the formation was in chaos, the Tatar cavalry's counterattack with bows and arrows no longer had the ability to deter them. They could only passively take a beating. In the end, even General Su He himself separated from the main force with only a dozen soldiers. He still wanted to gather the scattered soldiers, but he didn't know where to find them. He sighed inwardly at his brother's good luck and could only lead the dozen or so personal guards to chase in the direction of the main force. The 3,000 Tatar cavalry were defeated just like that. Apart from the initial threat of the arrows, they didn't put up any decent resistance. From start to finish, they only delayed Yang Chendong's troops for a little more than 2 hours. The main force of the mercenaries once again entered the process of chasing the enemy. During this time, the main force of the Tatar cavalry didn't run very far. This was because not long after they escaped from the southern forest under the leadership of Lord Agar Dorje, they encountered the Tiger's Man Independent Regiment and the Windchaser Regiment that were responsible for ambushing and blocking. The two regiments were ordered to guard the retreat of the Tatar cavalry. Just as they began to set up the battlefield and ambush, they saw many figures in the distance. The main force of the Tatar cavalry was rushing over. Attack! Tiger's Man didn't even have time to dig up the mines. He led his 3 gun brigades to launch a frontal assault on the retreating Tatar cavalry. The sudden gunshots, the dense gunshots without any warning, and the whistling of the flames that could be seen in the darkness, instantly disrupted the formation of the retreating Tatar cavalry. After a series of gunshots, at least a few hundred riders died on their horses, and over 1,000 were injured to varying degrees. Seeing the firearm battalion of the mercenaries here, Aga Dorji, who was following the army, naturally turned pale with fright. What he was more worried about wasn't how much of an attack he had suffered. He was more worried about why there were so many mercenaries here. Shouldn't they have been pinned down by General Glenn's headquarters on the northern slope of the West River? Could it be that their appearance here meant that something had already happened on both sides? As soon as this thought appeared in his mind, Agar Dorji felt uneasy. When the Kiliarchs came to ask for instructions, he actually didn't have a definite idea. Speaking of which, Agar Dorji's military talent wasn't very good. It was only because he was born into a good family and had followed his elder brother Tuachuobuhua since he was young that he gradually began to master the military. When it came to controlling people's hearts, he might have some methods, but when it came to commanding on the battlefield, his ability was far inferior. In his confusion, Agar Dorji, who didn't have much military talent to begin with, didn't have any better ideas. Faced with the instructions of his junior generals, he could only order the army to charge through the enemy's defensive line. Only in this way could they have a chance to escape. Without a strict organization, the Tatar cavalry charged in 1,000-men formation. However, facing Tiger's Man's 3-gun brigades, 7 cavalry brigades, and more than 2,000 cavalry from the Windchaser group, such a charge naturally caused heavy losses. The battle lasted for more than 2 hours. Apart from about 3,000 cavalry that managed to break through the encirclement, the rest of the Tatar cavalry were still trapped here, unable to escape. It was at this time that General Suhi rushed over with a dozen soldiers. Agar Dorji, who was at his wits' end, was overjoyed when he heard the news and wanted to hand over the command of the army to him. However, when the two met, General Suhi's head was already covered in cold sweat. The first sentence he said made Agar Dorji feel as if the heavens wanted to kill him. "Sir, behind me is the main force of the mercenaries. This time, with 2 sides surrounding us, I'm afraid that the army won't be able to escape destruction so fast." Hearing that the main force of the mercenaries was coming from behind, Agar Dorji felt as if the world was spinning and he couldn't see any hope. In contrast, Suhi was much calmer. Although the current situation was very difficult, it wasn't that they didn't have any advantages. For example, their current total military strength was higher than the enemy's. For example, it was now night and they were better at escaping. Of course, even if they had more military strength than the enemy, Suhi wasn't arrogant enough to think that they could achieve a full counterattack and achieve victory. The continuous escape had caused the army to lose the most important morale. To put it more harshly, the morale of the army might collapse at any time. Once that happened, there was no doubt that they would lose. Although Agar Dorji had many faults, such as being greedy, cowardly, bullying the weak, and fearing the strong, in any case, this person was still his superior. If Agar didn't put him in an important position, he wouldn't be where he was today. At this moment, Suhi made up his mind to repay Agar Dorji. "Your Excellency, it is impossible to turn the tables now. You can only escape and hope that you can rise again to take revenge for what happened today," Suhi said as if she had made some kind of decision. When he made this decision, he was also prepared to sacrifice himself at any time. Agar Dorji was shocked by Suhi's decision. He was a little touched and asked, "If I leave, what about you, General?" "Me? Of course I'll stay and lead the army to fight the mercenaries. If I don't do that, I'm afraid that you won't be able to take the opportunity to escape." Suhi smiled bitterly. Who didn't want to live? But when he was destined to sacrifice others, he could only choose to stay. After all, the other party was Agar Dorji and he was only a general under him. Agar Dorji of course knew this truth. At this moment, he was extremely excited and angry. He was excited because Suhi was willing to sacrifice him to protect himself. He was angry because this battle had cost them everything. From now on, he could no longer be a powerful force on the prairie. The glory of the past had nothing to do with him. Regardless of what he thought, Agar Dorji finally agreed to Su He's request and chose to leave. At this time, he really handed over the command of the army to Su He. He only left 3,000 elite cavalrymen with him to break out of the encirclement. After Su He got the command, the first thing she did was to let the soldiers around her spread the news that General Gulang of the North Slope and Hala Rua of the West River were coming here. As long as they could hold on until dawn, the army would come to support them and turn the tide. Of course, this was impossible. According to Su He's judgment, it was very likely that the two armies had met with mishap. Otherwise, where would the mercenaries find the strength to intercept him here? But he still had to tell the public this. Only then would the morale of the army not be in chaos and not collapse, creating a chance for Agar Dorji to escape. Sure enough, Su He's strategy was correct. After the news was released, the originally chaotic Tatar cavalry calmed down a lot. People were afraid of having no hope. As long as there was hope, anyone would think of a way to fight for it. The morale of the army was temporarily stabilized. Su He commanded the army to form a defensive line to block the attacks of the mercenaries behind him. At the same time, he sent 2,000 cavalrymen to charge at the mercenaries blocking the road. He wanted to tear a hole in the front in the shortest time possible to create a chance for Agar Dorji to escape. With the morale of the army stabilized, the orders were carried out seriously by the cavalrymen below. When Yang Chendong brought the main army to the rear of the Tatar cavalry, it was not as easy as expected. Instead, it was met with strong resistance. What's going on? Yang Chendong saw that many of the mercenaries were too careless and rushed too quickly. As soon as they entered the defensive line of the Tatar cavalry, they were submerged. In a short period of time, they lost hundreds of cavalrymen. He ordered his men to stop the attack and called over the scouts to ask about the situation. The battalion commander of the reconnaissance battalion, Su Yunsheng, had already joined the army at this moment. When he was called over by Yang Chendong for questioning, he told him what he saw. Sixth young master, the Tatar cavalry was indeed in chaos before, but because of the arrival of Su He, the situation changed. I don't know why they stabilized the morale of the army and had the power to fight back. After all, the time it happened was too short. It was already very difficult for the reconnaissance battalion to obtain this information. Yang Chendong did not mean to blame the other party. Instead, he asked with interest, after Su He came back, the morale of the army stabilized? It seems that this person has some ability. Yes, we learned from some of the prisoners that the order to retreat was also given by this person. It seems that his insight on the battlefield is also good. Beta Persei added. Then I am interested in this person. Yang Chendong laughed. Now was the time to use people. If the other party was really capable, then he did not mind recruiting him for his own use. It was just that the enemy had not been defeated yet. It was a bit too early to think about this. Like this, give the order. Don't rush to attack. When the army arrives, launch a fierce attack in units of battalions and companies. We need to advance in all directions. We can't do any individual breakthroughs. Also, the reconnaissance battalion must immediately figure out the situation and allow you to see the prisoners freely. Yang Chendong was not willing to fight a battle that he was not confident in. At least, he would not rashly launch a fierce attack before he figured out what was going on in the enemy camp. Chapter 7:18. Beta Persei and Su Yunsheng went to carry out the order. Soon, the mercenaries' attack changed from the previous random attacks to an organized advance. As a result, the Tatar cavalry fell into a situation where they were forced to retreat step by step. It was beyond Su He's expectation that the mercenaries behind him reacted so quickly. He guessed that there might be a general in the enemy's camp who knew more about tactics and was commanding them. But now, he was not concerned about this. He was more concerned about whether the 2,000 cavalrymen he sent would be able to open a bloody path for Lord Agar Dorji to escape. Under the command of Death, the 2,000 Tatar cavalrymen launched a suicidal attack. They were not afraid of the bullets and mercenaries who were several times their number. They just lowered their heads and charged forward. This kind of desperate fighting style finally allowed them to tear open a hole, giving Lord Agar Dorji an escape route. The 3,000 Tatar cavalrymen, who were also carrying hope, left the group. In addition to the ones who fled before, there were already 6,000 to 7,000 Tatar cavalrymen who rushed out. The Tatar cavalry paid a price. Of the 2,000 cavalrymen sent out, apart from those who died in battle or were captured, none of them returned to the barracks. Phew! Su He breathed a long sigh of relief. Her heart, which had been hanging high before, was relieved. Now that Agar Dorji had escaped, his only worry was gone. The next step was to fight a bloody battle with the mercenaries. He would use his death to prove that the Tatar cavalry was not to be trifled with. At this time, nearly 2 hours had passed since Yang Chendong summoned Su Yunsheng. In an hour, the sky would be bright. At this time, Battalion Commander Su finally learned from the captives that Su He was able to unify the troops and quickly reported it to the 6th young master. Oh! This Su He actually came up with such an idea. He really has some ability. After listening to Su Yunsheng's story, Yang Chendong couldn't help but sigh. This Su He was really a capable person. Previously, he didn't know how the other party did it, so he could only win step by step. But now that he knew the method the other party used, he only needed to find a way to counter it. How about this? Pass down my orders. Everyone, stop attacking and wait for daybreak. Once the enemy attacks, the musketeers will be at the front and the archers will be at the back, suppressing them from breaking through. This was not the result that Yang Chendong wanted to see. Since that was the case, he would just surround them and not attack. What he wanted now was not to destroy them, but to conquer them. The mercenaries suddenly stopped their fierce attacks, and the front line became quiet. This scene caught Su He, who was in the midst of the final battle, off guard. When he heard that there were no more sounds of killing coming from outside, he didn't know why, but he had a bad feeling. General, could it be that they are preparing for a big attack? Some Kiliarchs who were also confused came to Su He and asked for instructions. Someone asked, General, it's almost dawn. When will our reinforcements arrive? That's right. The soldiers below are looking forward to it. After a night of fighting, everyone is tired and suffered heavy losses. The soldiers below are very nervous. Su He obviously couldn't say that there were no reinforcements at all. Otherwise, the army would lose their morale and be unable to fight. In order to stabilize the situation, he could only continue to make arrangements. It's not far from dawn. The reinforcements should be here soon. What we need to do now is to accumulate strength. Once the reinforcements arrive, we will attack from the inside and outside and completely defeat the mercenaries. Hearing Su He's certainty, the Kiliarchs below couldn't help but smile with joy. They immediately agreed that they would do their best to stabilize the morale of the army before leaving. Su He, who was left behind, was puzzled. Could it be that the mercenaries were really preparing to launch a big attack? If that was the case, he had already decided to lead the army to fight to the death. When the time came, even if he died in battle, he would be able to deal a huge blow to the mercenaries. He wouldn't have lived in vain. But what if the other party wasn't going to attack? What if they had other plans? What should he do then? He looked up at the sky, although it was still so dark. However, Su He knew that the sky would brighten in 2 hours. In other words, there wasn't much time left for him to fight. Su He knew that he was going to die. He wanted to fight a bloody battle with the mercenaries and die on the battlefield with the dignity of a soldier. Unfortunately, the mercenaries didn't act according to his plan. They suddenly stopped attacking and just surrounded him from afar. This gave Su He a bad feeling in his heart. As the saying goes, what you are afraid of will come true. Just when Su He was wondering if the other party had figured out her plan, suddenly there was a shout from the front line. The voice that only belonged to the Han people came clearly at this moment. Brothers of the Tatar cavalry, you have been fooled. You won't have any reinforcements at all. No matter Hala Ruachu of the Shiha regiment or Jelong of the North Slope regiment, they have been defeated by our mercenaries. We even captured Hala Ruachu alive. Now, you are all alone. Surrender immediately. Otherwise, you will only die, and it won't be worth it. Tatar cavalry brothers, you have been fooled. We won't have any reinforcements, no matter. The shout came one after another. It was transmitted to the Tatar army through the simple loudspeakers. When the cavalrymen heard the news for the first time, they all looked at each other with ugly and angry expressions. Their faces were ugly because of the situation they were in. They were angry because they knew that they were fooled. For a moment, the camp was like a nest that exploded. No matter how hard the Kiliarchs tried, they couldn't suppress it anymore. Left with no choice, these Kiliarchs could only band together and come to Su He to ask for an explanation. Su He didn't panic like everyone thought. Instead, he rode on his horse calmly. Looking at the angry Kiliarchs, he lowered his head and admitted his mistake. I'm sorry everyone. I lied before. We might really have no reinforcements. What? Really no reinforcements? If that's the case, what should we do next? Without reinforcements, we won't be a match for the mercenaries. That's right. What should we do? General Su, please come up with a plan. The Kiliarchs all talked at once. Facing Su He, who admitted everything, they suddenly realized that they weren't that angry. After all, he didn't take the opportunity to escape. Instead, he stayed here like everyone else. With this, they couldn't vent their anger. First, Su He calmed the Kiliarchs down. Then, he talked about how to deal with the mercenaries. Brothers, it's obvious that the mercenaries want to use psychological tactics to win without a fight. If that's the case, we'll all become their prisoners. We'll even live a life worse than death. Since that's the case, why don't we give it a try? Maybe we'll have a chance to survive. Even if I can't escape and die on the battlefield, I can die a happy death and be a hero. General, you mean? The Kiliarchs had already guessed what Su He was going to do next. I mean, let's give it a try and kill our way out. Let's leave it to fate. Su He also knew that at this moment, he could only tell the truth. Only then would they have a chance to live. Breaking out of the encirclement wasn't an easy thing to do. Most people might even lose their lives here. But as Su He said, if they didn't do this, they didn't have any better choice now. These Kiliarchs looked at each other and finally nodded helplessly. After getting the support of these Kiliarchs, Su He immediately gave the order for the entire army to charge out under the cover of the moonlight. After the order was given, the Tatar cavalry who were still doubting whether they were tricked were speechless by General Su He's sincerity. Although they were angry, they didn't want to be captives. They didn't even dare to imagine what life would be like as captives. They could only try their best and hope that the heavens would take care of them and let them live. Every single one of them held on to the hope that they could survive. One by one, they unsheathed their cavalry sabers. Taking advantage of the fact that the sky had yet to brighten, they charged out to kill. When the hundreds and thousands of Tatar cavalry charged out, their battle formation was quite large. The moment the earth shook, the Tiger's Man independent regiment guarding the outermost perimeter felt it. As the regiment commander, Tiger's Man immediately ordered the 3 battalions of musketeers to get ready. At the same time, he ordered the soldiers who were burying the mines to retreat and prepare for battle. Behind the independent regiment, the Wind Chaser division that reinforced the 1st Regiment of Cavalry also prepared their bows and arrows, ready to fire at any time when the enemy approached. More and more Tatar cavalrymen were charging towards them. They seemed to have understood their situation. If their first charge was fruitless, then it would be even more difficult for them to come up with a good result. This time, the number of cavalrymen charging towards them increased, and their speed was also very fast. Although it was night, the earth was shaking, giving people the feeling that thousands of men and horses were bravely charging through a single plank bridge. Because of this, many of the mercenaries' expressions became very cold. Some of the soldiers even had cold sweat coming out of their palms. Sensing the nervousness of the soldiers, Tiger Edge, who had always been by Yang Chendong's side and had developed the aura of a general, laughed out loud. "Everyone, don't panic. We are well prepared. The enemy won't be able to rush over." As if to prove his words, a deafening explosion suddenly rang out. Streaks of fire soared into the sky and dyed the originally dark night. It actually lit up the eyes of the soldiers, allowing them to clearly see everything that was happening in front of them. Chapter 7:19. In the end, the Tatar cavalry still managed to rush into the landmines, triggering lightning and fire, sending countless enemy cavalry into the sky. After the landmines exploded, the fragments flew into the bodies of many Tatar cavalrymen, making them look like hedgehogs, screaming and wailing in pain. Under this kind of attack, the Tatar cavalry that rushed quickly became the target of the attack. Some of the cavalry at the front didn't even have time to shout before they were swallowed up by the ruthless power of the landmines. The powerful landmines caused the Tatar cavalry to involuntarily stop in their tracks. Their faces were pale as they looked forward. Their hearts were filled with complex feelings, but they were unable to speak. Fire! With the help of the monstrous flames, Tiger's man noticed that many Tatar cavalry had stopped 500 meters in front of them. He made a prompt decision and gave the order to fire. He knew that at this time, if he gave the enemy a heavy blow, it would be the last straw. It would play an extremely important role in deterring the enemy. With a loud shout, the 3 battalions fired at the same time. Although in the darkness, the accuracy of these auxiliary soldiers was greatly reduced, but the number of Tatar cavalry was large enough. Coupled with the fact that they weren't prepared at all, a burst of gunshots rang out. Who knew how many Tatar cavalry fell from their horses? First, the landmines sent people into the sky, then the firearms easily took people's lives. Under this kind of pressure, the Tatar cavalry had no choice but to retreat one by one. Originally, it seemed that the first attack with great momentum was fruitless. On the contrary, it was a big blow to their morale. After the failure of the assault, when most of the cavalry returned, many of them had a pessimistic expression on their faces. Many of them were already scared. In this kind of situation where they couldn't even see how many enemies there were and where they were, many of their brothers had died. This kind of fighting style really made them unable to see any hope of victory. After Su He learned about the situation at the front line, he couldn't say a word for a long time. He knew that the situation might be worse than he imagined. If they couldn't rush out, then wouldn't it mean that they could only choose to surrender? The battlefield once again fell into silence. The mercenaries' voices came again. It was still the same words as before, but compared to before, this time some people began to be moved. The curses were also much less than before. The persuasion continued and the sky finally began to brighten. After their vision returned to normal, the Tatar cavalry only felt more despair. In this kind of situation where their every move was clearly seen by the enemy, it would naturally be much more difficult for them to escape. At dawn, the persuasion continued, but the mercenaries didn't take a step forward. They also didn't rely on the advantage of the firearms in their hands to attack. Instead, they began to cook. Smoke spirals, and not long after, the aroma of meat. "Young master, our logistics camp's chefs are all here. They are still using the condiments produced in Crimson City. Along with the freshly slaughtered meat, it will definitely be fragrant. Yang Er walked in front of Yang Chendong as if he was presenting a treasure, looking for praise. Very good. Yang Chendong nodded with satisfaction. While looking at the Tatar cavalry camp, he said, "Food is the most important thing to the people. The temptation of food can often achieve the goal of invincibility." Yang Chendong's guess was right. Using food to lure the enemy had proven to be very useful. In the past, the mercenaries had often used this trick to destroy the enemy's morale. This time, it was also successful. Yesterday afternoon, before the sky turned dark, they had eaten dinner. Now, it had been nearly 12 hours. During their escape, because the mercenaries were chasing closely behind them, some of the pots and bowls of food they brought along were thrown away halfway. They thought that they could kill their way out before dawn, so no one was worried about this matter. But now, after dawn, many of the cavalry's stomachs began to growl. Although many of them had a certain amount of dry food on them, it was absolutely not a problem for them to survive for at least 2 or 3 days. But the problem was that was cold food. How could it be compared to hot food that was overflowing with the aroma of meat? After using the MSG and other things produced by Chiken City, the taste was particularly delicious. Saying that the aroma would spread for 10 miles might be an exaggeration, but with the morning breeze, it would not be a problem for it to spread for 2 to 3 miles on the open ground. When the aroma spread to the Tatar cavalry camp, many of the cavalry's expressions became somewhat abnormal. Especially those who were preparing to take out their dry food, their expressions became even more unsightly. Comparing people to people would lead to death, and comparing goods would lead to throwing away. Compared to the aroma of the fresh meat, the cold dry food was too tasteless. At this time, the voice urging them to surrender sounded again. Among them, there were some words about food. For example, the mercenaries promised that as long as they surrendered, they would immediately be able to eat fresh meat. At that time, they would be able to eat hot flatbread and drink meat soup. It would definitely be a delicacy. The picture outlined made many of the cavalry unable to help but make a swallowing motion. Then, the soldiers looked at each other, as if they were somewhat tempted. "Hello everyone, my name is Hulu, an authentic Mongolian. In a battle, I became a captive of the mercenaries. I originally thought that my life would be worse than death. But who would have thought that not only would I be able to live a better life and receive more money every month, I would also become a commander of 1,000 soldiers. The reason why I am telling you all this is to tell you that the reason why we gave up our homes and fought with our blood and flesh is because we want to live a better life. Right now, the opportunity is in front of you. As long as everyone surrenders to the mercenaries like me, as long as you have the ability, you do not have to worry about not being valued. This is the most realistic experience of a surrendered commander of 1,000 soldiers. Hello everyone, my name is Temu, a Nuzan cavalry. It was also in a battle that I became a captive of the mercenaries. Similarly, I am now a commander of a battalion. Now, I can save up a lot of money every month. Not only is my food better than before, my clothes are also better than before. Once this war is over, I can find a beautiful girl from the grassland and start a family. Then, I will have a bunch of children and live a life where I will not have to worry about food and drink. Ha! Hello everyone, my name is Lu Dai, and I am also a Nuzan. I am also a captive. Previously, I was a deputy Jianghu in Baiming's new, Gandusi region. Now that I am a deputy commander, my treatment is more than 10 times better than before. Come quickly, there is delicious food that can strengthen our bodies. There are even sharper and more durable cavalry swords. There are also more high positions waiting for you. As long as everyone is willing to work hard, your future is limitless. Hello everyone, my name is Yila, and I was originally a Jianghu in Baiming's new, Gandusi region. Now, I am a commander of the Nuzan cavalry. After coming to the mercenaries, the most authentic experience I have had is that they have the best military treatment in the world. They have the strongest weapons in the world. They also have the most generous rewards in the world. As long as you are here, as long as you can mount a horse and kill the enemy, as long as you are sincere enough, this place will become the paradise you have always dreamed of. Come, we welcome you. One by one, the officers stepped forward to share their experiences. They expressed their views on the mercenaries and their own experiences from different perspectives. They did not speak of any great principles, but the more simple their words were, the more they could gain the approval of the ordinary cavalry. They could resonate with them. As the voices of these officers reached the Tatar camp, the expressions of many of the cavalry changed. They were eager to move. It was as if they were only missing an opportunity to stand up and choose to surrender. The Kiliarchs who were in charge of them naturally felt this change. They all anxiously went to General Su He, hoping that he could think of a solution that would satisfy both sides. However, Su He did not say anything. He only looked at the sky helplessly and shook his head. Everyone had the right to choose their own way of life and their own future. He could not interfere. In fact, he could not interfere either. Otherwise, if he forcefully suppressed them, it would cause a mutiny. On the contrary, if these soldiers could have a good way out, he would be happy. Forget it. Since that is the case, let's send some of the injured soldiers to them first. It is also good to see if these mercenaries are true to their words. If they are, you can choose to surrender in order to live a better life. If not, then we'll fight them to the death. At worst, we'll just die. Hearing Su He's words, all the Kiliarchs were speechless. However, they could not refute it. Could they say that the general was wrong? Could it be that it was wrong for a general to find a way out for his soldiers? No one objected and they could not object. After the order was passed down, some of the wounded Tatar cavalry became the first batch of captives to be sent to the mercenaries. Then everyone watched helplessly as the mercenaries dispatched a lot of troops. They used a stretcher to carry the Tatar cavalry away from the battlefield. At this moment, some people were envious of the injured soldiers. It seemed that only the wounded could openly defect to the enemy without being blamed by anyone. There were still calls to surrender from time to time, but as time passed, no one knew if the Tatar cavalry had become numb or if there were orders from above. In short, no one saw any uninjured cavalry choose to surrender. Chapter 720. Time passed little by little. When it was noon, the smell of meat came from afar. Along with it came another trump card. Some of the injured Tatar cavalrymen were sent back to the center of the battlefield. Brothers, I'm Gu Shan. I'm sure many of you know me. I was injured by an arrow and couldn't ride a horse, so I was sent to the mercenaries as a captive. A Tatar cavalryman on a horse shouted. Such a shout quickly caused a burst of discussion in the Tatar camp. That person is indeed Gu Shan. His hometown is not far from mine, so I know him. He is Gu Shan. He was originally with me. Even if he turned into ashes, I would still recognize him. I just didn't expect that when we left this morning, he couldn't get on a horse, but now he can ride a horse. Immediately, several Tatar cavalrymen took the initiative to testify, proving Gu Shan's true identity. After his identity was confirmed, Gu Shan's words were more credible. When he talked about his experience, everyone naturally chose to listen carefully. After listening to his story, they also knew what happened to him in the mercenaries. In Gu Shan's own words, although he was a captive, he was different from a captive. Since he and his injured companions came to the mercenaries, they were immediately surrounded by a group of medical officers called military doctors. Then, all kinds of examinations, all kinds of treatment, all kinds of medicine, and all kinds of methods were used. After the treatment, hot meat soup and flatbread were served in front of him. The people who surrounded him were also Mongolian men. Through the conversation, he knew that the Mongolian soldiers in front of him were not fake. Through the conversation, he gained a deeper understanding of the mercenary army system, and he also gained a deeper understanding of how the soldiers were treated. Gu Shan was a person who could speak. After he saw that many people were listening to him carefully, he bluntly announced that the treatment of soldiers was soldiers was 10 taels of silver a month, soldiers were 15 taels of silver a month. The so-called soldiers were the second-line troops with weaker fighting ability. The soldiers were naturally the first-line troops with tyrannical strength. When this treatment was announced, it immediately attracted the attention of the Tatar cavalrymen who were listening carefully. The Tatar cavalrymen were only paid 2 taels of silver a month. Of course, if there was a war, there would still be some extra benefits. For example, they could keep a portion of the things they looted. The military merits they obtained could also be exchanged for a portion of silver taels. But even so, on average, the amount of silver they received each month was still limited. It was far from being as generous as the salary of the mercenaries. Not to mention, according to what Gu Shan had heard, once the mercenaries were involved in a war, their rewards would only be greater. For example, if you killed an enemy on the battlefield, you could get a reward of 1 to 10 taels of silver. This also depended on who you killed. Hearing this, the Tatar cavalrymen's eyes revealed excitement and even yearning. The cavalry here were all Tatar elites. In terms of combat ability, they were more powerful than the Tatar cavalry at the West River and the North Slope. All capable people were conceded. Things like military exploits were as easy as eating a meal in their hands. Who wouldn't be tempted when they heard that they could receive so many rewards for their military service? The so-called capable people needed a platform to display their abilities, and the mercenary group was obviously a very good platform to display their abilities. It made the hearts of the capable people yearn for it. Speaking of the treatment of the Mongol cavalrymen, although their ability to march and fight was very strong, due to the constraints of the environment, they did not seem to have much creativity other than fighting and hurting. Because of this, their treatment had always been very poor. It was even worse than the Baiming army, the original Nuzan tribe, and the Mongol tribe in Narcissus town. The price they paid was not proportional to the benefits they received. This made many of the Tatar cavalrymen resentful. But when they thought about how everyone was like this on the Mongolian grassland, they slowly balanced out. But balance did not mean that they had truly accepted it. They still wanted to prove themselves and improve their treatment. After all, with money, they could do many things. This was something that everyone knew. Why did the Mongol cavalrymen always like to plunder? It would not take long for them to think of attacking the Central Plains. Wasn't it because they were too poor? Everyone knew that the Central Plains was vast with abundant resources. The people there were also very rich. If they did not target them, who else would they target? Although many people would die in every war, compared to the benefits, the risk was worth it. But now, they did not need to go out of the grassland to plunder others. They could also receive good treatment. This was equivalent to having benefits in front of them. How many people would not be tempted? How many people would be able to ignore it? At this time, it was not only the ordinary Tatar cavalrymen. Some of the Tatar centurions and kiliarchs were also tempted. Gu Shan had just said that an ordinary soldier's monthly salary was at least 10 taels of silver. As a small general, they would receive even more. If they followed this treatment and worked in the mercenary army for a few years, wouldn't they have enough money to marry a wife, build a house, and buy sheep and horses? If they really had money and a happy and comfortable life, who would want to go to war and take risks? Gu Shan's appearance made many people have a better understanding of the mercenary army and yearn for it. In the following time, more Tatar cavalrymen like Gu Shan who had been treated with minor injuries were released. They came to the center of the two armies and began to help spread the benefits of the mercenary army. One person's words might not be credible, but what about 10 people, 100 people, or more? Not to mention that the original words were true, with so many people saying the same thing, even if it was false, it would become true. As more and more of their original companions came forward to speak, gradually, no one doubted the truth of the matter. On the contrary, everyone's eyes were full of stars, imagining the various benefits after joining the mercenary army. Gu Shan and the others were sent out because they had received a certain promise from the mercenary army. For example, the so-called mercenary logistics battalion commander Beta Persei, who was in charge of receiving them, said that as long as they helped persuade the Tatar cavalrymen, once they chose to surrender, not only would they receive a reward of 100 taels of silver for their military service, but after their injuries were healed, their ability would be tested first and they would be able to enter the corps. Even if it was for themselves, Gu Shan and the others would go all out and do their best to praise the mercenary army to the best of their ability. Their efforts finally paid off. Under the extreme temptation of words, finally a bold Tatar cavalryman walked out of the camp and came to the center of the two armies, expressing his willingness to surrender to the mercenary army. His appearance was naturally welcomed by Gu Shan and the others. In the warm applause, the mercenary army also sent out 2 battalions of soldiers to welcome him. Immediately, a special person came forward to register. The officer in charge of the reception also praised the Tatar cavalryman for daring to be the first to come forward. He said that if this person performed well, he would be given more consideration for his promotion. With such a living example in front of them, the other Tatar cavalrymen finally couldn't help but take the initiative to stand out. They scrambled to be the first, as if they were afraid that all the benefits would be taken away by others if they were late. More and more Tatar cavalrymen chose to surrender. They put down their weapons, jumped off their horses, and joined the mercenary army. Because of this, the tension of the previous war slowly disappeared. So much so that the originally tense string was also relaxed. There were also examples of centurions and kiliarchs joining the mercenary army. In the main camp of the Tatar cavalry, Suhi stood at the entrance of the large tent. He looked at everything that was happening in front of him from afar and was speechless for a long time. There was no expression on his face. He couldn't tell if he was happy or disappointed. Suhi's mood was indeed a bit complicated. You could say that he was happy. So many of his brothers had a way to live, so he was naturally happy. But at the same time, he was worried that the mercenary army would not treat his brothers well. Since they had surrendered, it was the same as fish on the chopping board, waiting to be slaughtered. If all of this was fake, then what should he do? Under such a worried mood, Gu Shan, who had done his best to talk, crossed the line between the two armies and arrived in front of Suhi. This was deliberately requested by Suhi. He wanted to contact Gu Shan alone and use his experience to judge whether what Gu Shan said was true or false. Seeing that Gu Shan had arrived, he calmly turned around and walked into the large tent. He spat out a sentence, "Come with me." Gu Shan was naturally cautious and even a little nervous. After all, he was just an ordinary Tatar cavalryman. It was impossible for him to meet a general like Suhi who commanded tens of thousands of troops. But now, they could actually meet alone. It was imaginable how his mentality had changed. As soon as he entered the tent, it was incomparably cold. Suhi turned his head and said casually, "Sit anywhere." "Thank you, General. I'm used to standing." Gu Shan was still very aware of his identity. He didn't sit down but stood respectfully at the side. Suhi saw Gu Shan's performance, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he sat down and asked casually, "Tell me everything you saw after going to the mercenary camp and the benefits they promised you. Remember, don't lie. If I find out, you'll never be able to walk out of this tent." There wasn't the slightest anger in his voice, and there wasn't even the slightest murderous intent. However, these words brought a lot of pressure to Gu Shan, so much so that he suddenly broke out in cold sweat. It also gave him a feeling that it was best not to lie in front of General Suhi. Otherwise, he would definitely lose his life here. Chapter 721. Yes, General, I will report truthfully. Gu Shan said very sincerely, then he recounted everything that happened when he entered the mercenary camp in detail. He even told Beta Persei about the things that he promised him. General, I didn't say a single lie. Everything I said is true. I also saw our mercenary Tatar soldiers in the previous battle in the barracks. Most of them were treated well. Although they were locked in military tents, they were not beaten, scolded, or reprimanded. They even had a fixed time to come out every day. And once some of them were willing to surrender, they would immediately be separated and receive better treatment. Even those soldiers who did not make a choice for the time being would be able to eat their fill for 3 meals and would not go hungry. Su He nodded from time to time as he listened carefully to Gu Shan's detailed account of everything he saw. He could feel that Gu Shan was not lying. He had interrupted several times and then asked the previous questions again. The answers he got were the same. There was no difference. He learned more about the mercenary army from Gu Shan's mouth. He also knew that his soldiers were doing well. He could finally rest assured. He slowly closed his eyes, then waved his hand and said, "Very good, thank you for telling me so much. You can leave now." Gu Shan, who could leave, did not immediately move. Instead, he took the initiative to say after struggling in his heart, "General, don't you choose to join the mercenary army? They are indeed treated well, and their mental outlook is not worse than our Tatar cavalry. Don't say any more. Otherwise, you will only force me to change my mind about not killing you. You can leave now." Although he did not say anything more, Su He had already expressed his determination with practical actions. That is, others can surrender, but he will not. No matter what, he was a general who once commanded tens of thousands of cavalry. How could he choose to surrender in exchange for a new life? At this point, Su He was about to get angry. By right, this should be the time for Gu Shan to leave. However, he still didn't move. Instead, after a moment of hesitation, he suddenly said, "General, the mercenaries hope to see you join them. They even promised you the opportunity to lead an army alone after you join them. He also said that if you don't go, young Master Haraluo's life will be in danger." Listening to Gu Shan's noisy words, Su He was about to get angry. Was his expression not clear and specific enough? Why was the other party still trying to persuade him? He had to show the other party some power. Just as he was about to punish Gu Shan, he suddenly heard the last sentence. When he heard Hararuo's name, his originally closed eyes suddenly opened. "What did you say? If Harak is still alive, how is he now?" Su He finally reacted, which made Gu Shan breathe a sigh of relief. Before coming, Beta Persei told him that if possible, he could help persuade Su He. For this, he even wrote him a letter. But Beta Persei also said that this mission could be abandoned. After all, it was too dangerous. No one would blame him if he didn't complete it. Of course, if he completed it well, there would be additional rewards and so on. On the way to see Su He, Gu Shan thought a lot. In the end, he decided to give it a try. This was not only because of the generous rewards, but also because of a more important reason. He respected General Su He very much and didn't want to see the general die because he didn't surrender. So he finally mustered up the courage to give it a try. Now, it seems that he finally made the right bet. Gu Shan happily took out the letter from his arms and handed it to Su He. "General, this is a letter from the mercenary general. There should be the answer you want in it. Take a look." Su He didn't hesitate to take the letter, then opened it and read it. He finally knew what happened at Shiha and the North Slope. It was as he expected and guessed. Whether it was the 5,000 Tatar cavalry at Shiha or the 10,000 Tatar cavalry at the North Slope, they were all defeated. The defeat was very thorough. General Golang, who was in charge of the North Slope, was killed in the chaos. Harak, who led the 5,000 Shiha cavalry, was lucky and was captured alive. Now he was in the hands of the mercenaries, who originally wanted to kill him. But if Su He was willing to surrender, this person would not die. This was the promise of the mercenary leader, the great Ming dynasty's loyalty and courage. It also expressed the other party's importance to him. At the end of the letter, there was also Yang Chendong's handwriting. General Su He, I have long heard of your ability to command troops. I look forward to it. If you are willing to return, you will be put in an important position. The great Ming dynasty's loyalty and courage is a great promise. Just this line of words, in Su He's eyes, was as heavy as 10,000 kilograms. It made Su He feel touched. The fact that the other party was trying so hard to subdue him made him feel a little happy in his heart. A good bird chooses a good tree to nest in. Any capable person would want to find a wise master. Only in this way would they not bury their talents. Su He also had a great dream in his heart. That was to rule the entire grassland like his predecessor, the greatest hero in his heart, Genghis Khan. Then, he would let the Mongolian cavalry conquer the world and achieve supreme hegemony. Unfortunately, this dream was completely lost because he followed Agha-Dorji. This was a greedy person, a short-sighted person. As long as he could eat his fill, wear warm clothes, and have enough power, he would stop moving forward. If he followed such a person, he might be able to barely survive, but it was obviously impossible to achieve great things. If the other party did not promote him and put him in an important position, Su He would have left long ago. He originally thought that he would not have the chance to fulfill his wish in this life, but now, the opportunity was in front of him again. The Duke of Loyalty and Courage, the legendary war god, who could easily defeat Yes Hen, had extended an olive branch to him. How could he not be excited? But sometimes, being excited was not enough. What really moved Su He was that as long as he chose to surrender, he could save Hara Ruoxian's life. This hit his heart, making him enter into a situation where he had no choice. Without Agha-Dorji's attention and promotion, Su He would not be where he was today. In order to repay the favor, he risked his life to let the other party leave. Logically speaking, he had already repaid the favor. But this didn't seem to be enough. He didn't just want to call it even, he also wanted the other party to owe him a favor. This way, no matter who talked about this matter in the future, they wouldn't blame him anymore. And if he could save Hara Ruoxian, it would be equivalent to making Agha-Dorji owe him a big favor. That would be perfect. Is Hara Ruoxian still alive? I want to see him before making a decision. Although Su He was already moved, he did not show it. Instead, he said very calmly, "Yes, I will pass on the general's request to the mercenary general. You just have to wait for the news." Gu Shan naturally could not make any promises. He also did not have the authority to do so. All he could do was to pass on the original words. "Okay, I will give us 2 days. If we still do not see Hara Ruoxian in 2 days, then you are deceiving me. At that time, even if I have to risk my life, I will fight you to the end." Su He's voice became cold, releasing a murderous aura. "Yes." Gu Shan was affected. After hurriedly agreeing, he left the tent. Not long after, this news was passed back to the mercenary camp. Regarding Su He's request, the officers below had different opinions. Someone suggested that Hara Ruoxian could not be handed over. This person had previously had unfavorable thoughts towards the 6th young master and even fought a big battle at the short stone pile. He was also Agha-Dorji's only son. This person could not be let go and should be killed. Moreover, the other party was not surrounded. The news said that at least 6,000 Tatar cavalry had escaped. It was hard to guarantee that they would not become a threat in the future. As soon as this idea was put forward, it received a lot of support. Everyone thought that it was not worth it to let go of Hara Ruoxian for the sake of Su He, a loser. With so many people supporting this idea, the voices of quarreling in the tent quickly disappeared. After reaching a consensus, everyone's eyes fell on Yang Chendong, who had been sitting at the head of the tent without speaking. 1,000 soldiers are easy to obtain, but a general is difficult to find. You must have all heard of it. With a smile on his face, Yang Chendong's eyes swept across the faces of the officers in the tent. Su He's ability is obvious to all of you. Let me ask everyone a question. In front of the mercenaries, if you were to command the Tatar cavalry, can you guarantee that you would do better than Su He? Yang Chendong didn't go to talk about any great principles. Instead, he used facts to speak. Just a question was thrown out, and the tent immediately became silent. They asked themselves, unless they knew all of the sixth young master's plans, and if they worked together, they might have a chance of winning. Otherwise, they would not be able to win this battle. It could be said that the moment the Tatar cavalry became enemies with the mercenaries, they had already lost. I know that many of you look down on the general of a defeated army. But what I want to say is that defeat is not the fault of the general. Whoever commands this army will have the same result. So why should you look down on Su He? As for defeats, most of you have experienced them before, right? When have I ever looked at you in a different light? When this question was asked, many of the faces in the tent became red. This was especially true for Yella and Lu Dai, who were the commander of the Jurchen cavalry division. Their faces were flushed red. Weren't they the general of a defeated army? It was because of their ability that they were chosen by Yang Chendong and placed in an important position. Chapter 722. Even if he was such a person, what qualifications did he have to look down on others? Everyone stopped talking. Yang Chendong smiled and said, "As for Haraluo, a dead person has no value. If we can use a person who is already dead in our eyes in exchange for Su He's sincere surrender, it is worth it. Don't you think so?" This time, no one said anything. This was not only because Yang Chendong's prestige was too high, to the point that his words carried enormous weight. More importantly, what he said was indeed very reasonable, making it difficult for everyone to find a place to refute. Because Yang Chendong expressed his opinion, the matter was settled. He immediately let the scouts return to the first city and bring Haraluo to the battlefield. Yang Chendong also made the decision to go to the Tatar cavalry army to see Su He personally. Naturally, some people showed concerns about this decision, but Yang Chendong said that he had confidence in the Black Knights. In addition, the mercenaries could press to the front line. Once they found that the situation was not right, they could immediately launch a general attack. Finally, the other officers could not say anything. The scout left quickly and returned quickly as well. After only a day and a half, Haraluo was brought in front of Yang Chendong. Compared to the last time they met, this person was slightly embarrassed. It should be because he had not washed his face for a few days. He gave people the feeling that he was very listless. "Come, fetch water for him to wash his face and get him a set of clean clothes to change into." Yang Chendong just casually glanced at Haraluo, then looked away. If such a small person was not still useful now, perhaps he would not take a second look at him in his life. Haraluo was taken away. When he followed Yang Chendong and the 100 or so black-clad knights out of the mercenary camp, it was as if he had changed into a different person. He was much more energetic. Although his appearance had recovered a lot, it could still be seen from his constantly moving eyes that he was still very afraid at this moment. After becoming a captive, he no longer knew what his future path was. He didn't even know when he would die. Under this shadow, he didn't dare to say anything. Once he noticed that the surrounding black-clad soldiers were looking at him, he tried his best to put on a flattering smile to curry favor. To Haraluo's horror, he was surprised to find that after leaving the mercenary camp, they were actually heading towards the Tatar army. He carefully looked at the black knights beside him. There were only a little more than 100 of them. He really couldn't understand. Would such a small number of people really dare to bring him to the Tatar cavalry's camp? Could this be the so-called boldness of the skilled? While thinking, Yang Chendong led more than 100 black knights through the ceasefire battlefield, heading straight for the Tatar camp. Along the way, they saw many Tatar cavalry who were hesitating whether to surrender or not. When they saw Yang Chendong and the 100 black knights, their eyes were also filled with shock and confusion. In front of the largest tent in the Tatar cavalry's camp, Su He stood to welcome them. When he saw the black knights coming from afar and Hilario in the group, his face didn't change, but his heart was really shocked. The mercenaries really did send Hilario over. They really kept their word. Everyone, since you are here, why don't you take a seat in the main tent? In the spirit of hospitality, and also wanting to test the other party, Su He made an invitation. Of course, he also wanted to test them. He wanted to see if the mercenaries were really so bold, and if they had the courage to do so. Of course. The one who answered him was Yang Chendong, riding the white dragon horse at the head of the group. Along the way, he didn't panic, as if he was walking in his own camp. He didn't show the slightest sign of weakness. On the contrary, when he came in front of Su He, his eyes were still constantly looking at this person, as if he was looking at a treasure. Yang Chendong, who agreed, dismounted from his horse and led Beta Persei and Qiu Vi, as well as Badao Jiang and Peng Yu who were escorting Hilario and strode into the tent. As soon as they entered the tent, they could see that both sides of the tent were filled with executioners holding swords and sabers. There were about 50 of them. They were glaring angrily at Yang Chendong and the others who came in. It was as if they would chop the intruders into minced meat at the slightest command. You are cheating, how dare you? After Beta Persei and Qiu Vi saw the situation in front of them, they stood on the left and right respectively and pulled out their sabers. Their eyes were filled with anger and killing intent. On the other hand, Yang Chendong wasn't confused by the scene in front of him. Instead, he smiled and looked at Su He who had already walked to the front and was 3 meters away from him. He asked, "Is this how you treat your guests?" At this time, Yang Chendong not only showed that he wasn't afraid, but in fact, he really wasn't. Hilario was still in his hands and hadn't been handed over to the other party yet. Just based on this, the other party didn't dare to act rashly. According to his analysis, the reason why they put on such a posture was just to scare him. While Yang Chendong was speaking, Badao Jiang and Peng Yu also tightened their grip on the sabers in their hands. The sabers were placed on Hilario's neck. It seemed that this movement would draw blood, causing Hilario to cry out in alarm. Su He, don't act rashly, don't act rashly. Instead of scaring the others, Su He scared his own people. There was a trace of disappointment in his eyes. Then he waved his hand, and the 50 axemen took a step back in unison, maintaining a safe distance from Yang Chendong and the others. After expressing a certain amount of goodwill, Su He looked at Yang Chendong and asked, "Can you let them go now?" Logically speaking, the danger wasn't over yet. Letting them go now was equivalent to putting themselves in danger. If it was anyone else, they wouldn't agree so easily. However, Yang Chendong wasn't an ordinary person. 50 axemen wasn't a small number, but it wasn't a big deal in his eyes. The 4 men he brought with him could each fight against 10 men, and his own strength was unfathomable. Outside the tent, Dao Shao was leading more than 100 black knights. It was impossible for them to fend off an army of 10,000, but it would not be a problem for them to fend them off for a while. Once chaos broke out here, the mercenaries outside would charge in. These were the reasons why he was so confident. Because of this, after hearing Su He's question, Yang Chendong smiled. Of course we can let them go. I originally wanted to give them to you. Come, let young Master Hilario go. Badao Jiang and Peng Yu were stunned for a moment. However, this was the 6th young master's order. Although the 2 of them were reluctant, they still put down their sabers and pushed Hilario to Su He's side. This action also gave Su He a fright. What he said just now was just to test the waters. If the other party didn't let him go, he would definitely mock them and point out that the mercenaries were also as timid as mice. He could use this opportunity to suppress the other party's momentum. But now, the other party really let them go. Just this magnanimity and boldness made him speechless. Su He didn't know what to say. Hilario, who was released, finally regained his freedom. He suddenly shouted, "General Su, quickly capture these people. Their status isn't low. We can threaten them to make the mercenaries pay the price." Along the way, although he didn't know Yang Chendong's true identity, he had met him twice. In addition, when he left the mercenaries' camp, he could see that many people looked at Yang Chendong with very respectful gazes. Just based on this, he guessed that this person's status wasn't ordinary. Thus, he shouted loudly. At this moment, Hilario's style of being an ingrate was incisively and vividly displayed. These words also made the surrounding 50 executioners move. Just now, the other party had hostages in their hands, so they didn't dare to act rashly. But now, the enemy had nothing, so they didn't put him in their eyes. Hilario's shout also made Beta Persei, Chio V, and the other two become very nervous. The four of them even involuntarily touched their waists. They all came with pistols. If the situation goes out of control, they will pull out their guns and kill. However, Yang Chendong still didn't panic. Instead, he looked at Su He and smiled, as if to tell everyone that he was not an enemy, but a friend. Su He was also one of the calmer people. At least he didn't shout, nor did he have the intention to order the arrest. Instead, he looked at Yang Chendong, his eyes full of curiosity. "But I don't know who you are." Seeing Yang Chendong's calmness, and also seeing that this person was the leader of the Black Knights, Su He was indeed interested. This person's boldness and courage were something he had never seen in his life. With this alone, this person was worthy of respect. "What? General Su, you really don't know who I am? Well, I will tell you, listen carefully, I am the Great Ming's loyal duke, the one you call the War God." With a smile still on his face, Yang Chendong revealed his identity word by word. Loyal Duke? War God. The moment the name was said, not only Su He, but also the 50 executioners involuntarily took a step back, their faces showing a look of horror. What was the meaning of a person's name, the shadow of a tree, was perfectly interpreted at this time. After a brief panic, everyone carefully looked at Yang Chendong. After all, it wasn't the first time they heard the name of the War God, but it was rumored that this person had 3 heads and 6 arms and was 3 feet tall. But now, looking at him, he was the same as them, but younger and more handsome. You are the War God?" Su He asked in disbelief. "It's true. And when you go to the mercenary army in the future, you will naturally know that I am not lying," Yang Chendong said with a smile, almost patting his chest and taking out his ID card as proof. Chapter 723. It really was the War God. Su He was truly excited. The true men of the grasslands all worshipped heroes. Without a doubt, the War God who could defeat the Walla's leader, Yes Hen, naturally belonged to the category of heroes. In the past, they had only heard of his name. Now that they had finally seen him in person, how could they not be excited? Not to mention, the War God was now the commander of the mercenaries. He could even decide the life and death of many of them. Of course, what made Su He even more excited was that this person actually came to her in person, and he just wanted to recruit her. At that moment, he felt that he was extremely valued. That feeling was very good and made him feel very comfortable. Hilario was also frightened by the War God's name. But soon, his eyes shone with excitement. This was the War God, someone who even Yes Hen was afraid of. If he could capture this person and give him to Yes Hen, he would definitely be able to exchange for a lot of good things. At that time, wouldn't he gain both fame and fortune? His faction would also have a great opportunity to develop. He would also be regarded as a hero by the grasslands warriors. Thinking about the various benefits he could obtain, Haraluo couldn't suppress the excitement in his heart. He shouted at the executioners in the tent, "What are you all standing there for? Hurry up and capture him. This is a great contribution." His voice was shouted out, and the crowd of executioners were also moved. But no one moved. Instead, they all looked at Su He. Su He was the commander here. They could only listen to his orders. Seeing that no one moved and instead looked at Su He, Haraluo was unhappy. He said with a dark face, "Did you not hear what I said? Let me tell you, if you don't listen, I will hand you over to my father. At that time, even Su He won't be able to protect you." Poor Haraluo, he still didn't know that his father had already escaped with 3,000 cavalry. He thought that no one could stop him from doing anything with his father's name. Haraluo had exposed his true face. This made Su He very unhappy. The war god was willing to take the risk alone. This was a display of courage and wisdom, but how could it not be that he trusted himself? Although he also wanted to defeat the battle god, that would bring him both fame and fortune. However, if he wanted to defeat them, he would have to defeat them fair and square on the battlefield. He would not have to resort to petty tricks and use the other party's trust to make a move. If he did that, he would not be a hero. In fact, he would be worse than a coward. That's enough. Suddenly, Su He roared and stopped Haraluo's shouting. He then cupped his fists and said to Yang Chendong, "So it's the battle god. Sorry for the disrespect." He, Yang Chendong was very satisfied with Su He's performance. The fact that the other party didn't make a move was enough to prove that he was a straightforward and upright man. Such a person was always worthy of others' trust. He smiled and said, "It's fine. I've admired General Su's talent for a long time. How about it? You gave me the conditions to send Haraluo back. Not only did I send him back, but I also appeared here personally. Does this count as showing enough sincerity?" He took the opportunity to state his purpose. These words caused Su He's face to turn red. If he had only wanted to test the sincerity of the mercenaries before, the other party's performance was too good. It was so good that he had nothing to say. As a man, once a promise is made, even 4 horses cannot go back on it. Su He was moved by Yang Chendong's sincerity. He immediately cupped his fists and said, "Battle god, Su He, am very difficult to convince others, but I truly submit to you. From now on, Su He is willing to serve by your side. Please accept me." As he spoke, he knelt on the ground. Su He finally lowered his head. "Ha ha ha, good, good." Yang Chendong was naturally overjoyed. He laughed and took a few steps forward. He came in front of Su He and reached out to help him up. Then the monarch and minister looked at each other and smiled. Everything was understood without words. Su He expressed his intention to surrender. This scared Haraluo. Instead of his overbearing attitude, he stood obediently at the side like a cat. When he noticed Yang Chendong's gaze, he even tried his best to squeeze out a smile. He didn't even think about how he wanted to kill Yang Chendong just now. Yang Chendong did not even spare him a second glance. Such a person was not worthy of his attention. Yang Chendong did not even spare him a second glance. If it wasn't for the fact that he wanted Su He to join the mercenaries, this person would have died countless times. Yang Chendong could ignore Haraluo, but Su He couldn't. With the intention of returning the favor, he first glanced at Haraluo, then at Yang Chendong and said, "War god, this subordinate has a presumptuous request, but I don't know if I can say it." "There's no harm in saying it," Yang Chendong said very generously. "This subordinate wants to send Haraluo away. If other Tatar cavalry are willing to follow, please don't stop them. As for the rest, this subordinate will try my best to persuade them to work for the mercenaries. Please allow it. This was equivalent to the last condition. It was also Su He's end to some things. Since he had already done so many things, there was no harm in doing one more. Yang Chendong immediately nodded and said, "Okay, I promise you." "Thank you, War God." Su He's attitude was already very respectful. After he finally made his choice, he relaxed a lot. In front of the big tent, more than 100 black-clad cavalry rode on horses. They wore black iron masks, so people couldn't see their expressions at all. However, a solemn murderous aura leaked out uncontrollably. The Tatar cavalry who wanted to watch could only watch from afar. Time passed by minute by minute. The sixth young master still hadn't come out. Fortunately, there were no sounds of fighting coming out of the big tent. But before there was a result, all the black-clad cavalry maintained their best state. They looked like they would pull out their swords and open fire once the order was given. In fact, they didn't just pull out their swords. Therefore, the black-clad cavalry carried a Type 95 on their back. Everyone's body was full of magazines. Even the quiver was full of grenades. This was just in case. Just when the tension was so high that a random sound could lead to a chaotic battle, the curtain of the big tent was finally lifted from the inside. Yang Chendong, wearing a red cloak, strode out. Beside Yang Chendong were Beta Persei, Qiu Vi, and the others. Compared to when he went in, there was one more person beside him, Su He. It could be seen that the other party intentionally stood behind Yang Chendong, and he even showed a very respectful look. After walking out, Yang Chendong first nodded lightly to Dao Xiao and the other guards to show that he was fine. Then, he turned to look at Su He and said, "You may begin." "Yes." Su He cupped his fists and answered. Then, he strode away from Yang Chendong's side and walked to a place about 10 meters away from the big tent. Then, he jumped onto a warhorse and shouted from above, "Everyone, pay attention. Gather here. This general has an important matter to announce." At this time, the Tatar camp had experienced a few battles. After sending away all the wounded and a portion of people who had chosen to surrender, there were still about 7,000 people in the camp. With so many people gathered together, the momentum was still very great. Fortunately, they were worthy of being called an elite army. Even when they gathered, they were very orderly. No one panicked. Everyone stood in an orderly manner, either close or far away. However, their eyes were all on Su He, waiting for the general's next order. After about the time it took for an incense stick to burn, the camp was once again safe. There were already very few people who continued to walk around. Su He's shout finally rang out, and that resounding voice also reached the ears of every soldier. "I am Su He. I have already made the decision to surrender and join the mercenary army. Brothers, if you believe in me, then please join me for a brand new beginning." The crowd was silent at first, but then, there was a deafening shout. It was clear that this decision was very popular with the soldiers. Many people were already moved, but because there were still many people who had not made a choice, they could not force themselves to stand out. Thus, they endured it. Now that even the general had decided to surrender to the mercenary army, they finally had nothing to worry about. The shouts came one after another, and it took a while for them to gradually calm down. Su He's voice continued to ring out, "Young Master Haruo has already been sent back. If anyone is willing to follow young master, I will not stop or oppose. You can leave with him. Those who do not wish to join the mercenary army can also leave with young master first. When you feel that it is safe or the time is ripe, you can leave on your own. From now on, everyone will go their separate ways. However, if one day we meet on the battlefield, we will definitely not be lenient. I hope that everyone can understand, and I also hope that those who leave will take care of themselves. He had given everyone another choice. He had spoken very gently at the beginning, but at the end, he had said such a sentence, which was full of threat. When these words entered the ears of the army, it indeed caused the faces of those who had ulterior motives to tighten. They had no choice but to think about it. If they really left, where would they go in the future? Moreover, the strength of the mercenary army was so strong. If they were to become enemies, would they be able to win? To put it simply, would they have a chance to survive? Yang Chendong heard Su He's words and laughed in his heart. This person really did have some tricks up his sleeve. It was clearly a threat, but he used such a method to make it seem as if he was thinking for everyone. This was indeed a talent. At this point, Yang Chendong was no longer worried about the choice of the Tatar cavalry. With Su He, this powerful general, he would definitely be satisfied with the result. In order to not create pressure for the other party and be able to do things freely, Yang Chendong left with more than 100 black-armored cavalry. You're tuning in to the Unparalleled SwordWill YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.